They thought $15,000 would be enough to silence a woman whose very life had been defined by fighting against silence. In the dimly lit chamber, the check was slid across the table like a final punctuation mark, an arrogant gesture meant to end the story before it even began. To them, it was just money. To Jasmine Crockett, it was an insult, an attempt to put a price tag on her dignity, her voice, her very existence in the fight for justice. The room seemed to pause in that moment. Cameras clicked, pens scratched, but beneath it all was a hush, the kind of silence that comes before either surrender or explosion. Across the aisle sat the figure who had engineered this move, smug, certain that this was the end of the confrontation. For years, they had relied on intimidation, on wealth, on the assumption that everyone eventually takes the deal, that everyone has a breaking point where principles give way to profit. But Jasmine Crockett was not everyone. She was a daughter of the South, a lawyer who had fought in courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her, a congresswoman who had endured insult after insult on the national stage and refused to bow. The arrogance of that $15,000 check was almost laughable compared to what she had already faced. It was meant to end her fight, but instead, it ignited it. Viewers watching later would replay that moment again and again, the smirk on the villain's face, the quiet rustle of papers, the expectation that she would fold. They would see Jasmine lean back, draw in a breath, and look not just at her opponent, but through them, as if peering at the entire system that believed silence could be purchased. Because this wasn't just about Jasmine. It was about every immigrant family that had been told to sit down and be grateful. It was about every young woman who had been underestimated in boardrooms, classrooms, and courtrooms. It was about every voter who had ever been told their voice didn't matter. $15,000 was supposed to erase all of that. Instead, it would become the spark of a legendary comeback. And yet, the check was only the beginning. What came next would push the stakes far higher, far beyond one woman, one insult, one sum of money. What came next would shake the room, the headlines, and the very story of who holds power in America. The insult of that check might have seemed small to those who offered it. $15,000 in the grand machinery of politics is pocket change. But that was precisely the point. To them, Jasmine Crockett's integrity was worth no more than the cost of a single dinner fundraiser. It was meant to demean her, to shrink her into irrelevance, to remind her of the hierarchy where voices like hers were never supposed to rise. And yet, the offer revealed something even bigger: fear. You don't try to buy silence unless you're terrified of what that voice can do when it refuses to be silenced. Her opponents understood the power of her words, her cross-examinations, her unflinching ability to cut through arrogance with precision. They knew that if she kept speaking, the cracks in their carefully built facade would widen until the whole structure collapsed. This wasn't just a political slight. It was a test of America's values. If Jasmine could be bought off, then the system could go on untouched, corruption humming along, voices of dissent muffled, the status quo intact. But if she resisted, if she turned that insult into fire, it would mean something much more dangerous for those who clung to power. It would mean the cracks were already spreading. The stakes weren't limited to the room that day. Beyond those walls, millions of Americans were carrying their own stories of being undervalued. The immigrant who worked 2 jobs only to be dismissed as expendable. The young activists told to wait their turn. The families fighting eviction, health bills, systemic barriers that wealthier neighbors never faced. For them, Jasmine's refusal wasn't symbolic. It was survival, a statement that dignity cannot be bartered away. And the danger for her adversaries was clear. If Jasmine's defiance caught fire, it would resonate across communities hungry for someone to prove that courage still mattered. It would remind people that silence is a choice, and that choice can be broken. The $15,000 might as well have been $15 million, because the message it carried was the same. Your silence has a price. But Jasmine knew silence was never neutral. Silence is complicity, and complicity was the one thing she had never and would never accept. She understood that accepting that check, even passively, even symbolically, would not only destroy her credibility, but also betray the countless people who looked to her as proof that their struggles mattered. The arrogance of her opponent was almost poetic. They believed that money still ruled the narrative, that no one could withstand its pull. They believed history would continue to bend in their favor as it always had. What they forgot was that history bends differently when someone is willing to put everything on the line to resist. As Jasmine's fingers brushed the edge of that paper, the weight of it wasn't in its value, but in its audacity. Every insult she had endured, Every dismissal she had faced, every barrier erected before her was now condensed into one crude offer. And in that moment, she realized this was never just about her. It was about whether dignity could still stand in the face of power. But as her eyes locked on the smug grin across the table, one thought pierced through louder than all the rest. What happens next changes everything. To understand the audacity of the $15,000 insult, you have to understand the man who orchestrated it. He was not new to the stage. For years, he had walked the halls of power with the confidence of someone who believed he could never be touched. Born into privilege, grown by institutions that reinforced his authority, he carried himself with the smug certainty that politics was a game designed for people like him, and people like Jasmine Crockett were intruders. His career had been built on two things: money and intimidation. When critics rose against him, he didn't argue them down with reason. He crushed them with resources, legal maneuvers, and strategic silence. He was a master of the quiet deal, the backroom handshake that dissolved dissent before it reached the public. To his allies, this was efficiency. To his opponents, it was corruption dressed up as competence. But there was something else about him that made this clash inevitable. He underestimated anyone who didn't fit his mold. Women, especially women of color, were to him side characters in the play where he was always the lead. His arrogance wasn't just personal, it was systemic, reinforced by decades of watching doors open for him that were slammed in the faces of others. To him, Jasmine's rise wasn't just surprising, it was offensive. He carried a record full of contradictions. He spoke of integrity while cutting deals that betrayed his own voters. He preached about family values while turning a blind eye to policies that tore families apart. He branded himself as a guardian of tradition, but the tradition he guarded was one in which wealth insulated men like him from accountability. Every speech he gave was polished, every smile rehearsed, but behind the performance was a relentless hunger for control. And control was slipping. That's why Jasmine became a threat. Her fire in hearings, her refusal to bow, her willingness to speak uncomfortable truths, these weren't just inconveniences, they were dangerous. Because unlike the seasoned politicians who often gave way for self-preservation, Jasmine seemed immune to the usual levers of pressure. She wasn't chasing wealth, she wasn't dazzled by power. Her very presence challenged the notion that the system was unshakable. So when the $15,000 check was slid forward, it wasn't just a payoff attempt. It was the antagonist reverting to the only language he trusted: money as dominance. It was the same tactic he had used to keep newspapers quiet, to sideline challengers, to grease the machinery of influence. In his mind, Jasmine was no different. Everyone had a price. Everyone bent eventually. But what makes villains compelling isn't just their schemes, it's their blindness. His fatal flaw was the inability to see that some people cannot be bought, that some voices grow louder the more you try to suppress them. He mistook stubbornness for naivety and principle for weakness. His allies whispered about Jasmine dismissively, echoing his tone. They said she was too emotional, too unpolished, too new. In their world, her very humanity was considered a flaw. And yet, that flaw was precisely what connected her to millions of people watching from outside those gilded halls. This wasn't just arrogance. It was fear disguised as confidence. Fear that the walls were crumbling. Fear that the old rules no longer guaranteed victory. Fear that the era of unchecked dominance was coming to an end. And fear that Jasmine Crockett, of all people, could be the one to prove it. He didn't see it that way, of course. In his eyes, this was just another move in a long career of winning battles. The check was a tool. Jasmine was an obstacle. The story was already written, until she turned the page. Because when arrogance collides with resilience, history doesn't favor the wealthy. It favors the ones who stand tall when standing tall seems impossible. And in this clash, the man who had spent his career silencing voices was about to face the one voice he couldn't mute. But what he didn't realize was that Jasmine's power didn't come from money or titles or backroom deals. It came from her story. And that story was about to take center stage in a way he could never have anticipated. To grasp the weight of Jasmine Crockett's defiance, you have to trace the road that brought her here. Hers was not the story of inherited privilege or guaranteed access. Hers was the story of a woman who had to claw her way into every room she entered, who knew the sting of being dismissed before she had even spoken, who learned early that the only currency she could truly rely on was resilience. Jasmine grew up in a world that didn't expect much from girls like her. The odds were calibrated against her. Classrooms where teachers assumed mediocrity, communities where resources were scarce, a culture that whispered she should be grateful for crumbs instead of reaching for the feast. But instead of shrinking, she sharpened. Every doubt cast on her became fuel. Every closed door hardened her resolve to find another entrance. Law was never supposed to be her path. It was too ambitious, too audacious. And yet, when she looked around at the injustices swirling in her community, the families priced out of homes, the endless churn of young men swallowed by a justice system designed to profit off their pain, she realized silence was not an option. The courtroom became her battleground. And on that battleground, she discovered something powerful. Her voice was a weapon no one could dull. She didn't enter politics from the polished pathways of elite connections. She entered through the grit of activism, through nights spent drafting motions for clients who couldn't afford a defense, through battles where she was outnumbered, outfunded, and underestimated. Her victories weren't just wins on paper, they were lifelines for people who had been told the system would never work for them. Each case she fought, each injustice she confronted, stitched another layer of armor into her being. By the time Jasmine entered Congress, she was already battle-tested. She had learned the rhythm of intimidation. The long silences, the smug dismissals, the whispered threats meant to rattle her composure. She had also learned something more important, that arrogance collapses when confronted with truth delivered without fear. Her presence in those hearing rooms was electric, not because she sought the spotlight, but because she carried into them the weight of everyone who had been shut out. And with that weight came clarity. She understood the stakes of being a Black woman in those halls. She understood how every misstep would be magnified, every passion branded as anger, every moment of defiance twisted into caricature. But she also knew this: representation means nothing if it bends. Her very existence there was not just symbolic, it was insurgent. Which is why the $15,000 attempt to buy her silence was almost laughable. How do you bribe someone whose entire career had been defined by refusing to bow? How do you cheapen the voice of a woman who had been forged in the fire of inequality? To Jasmine, that check wasn't intimidating. It was insulting. It revealed the emptiness of her opponent's imagination. They thought she could be reduced to a transaction. They thought her struggle could be erased with a signature. They thought wrong. Her story had always been about more than personal triumph. It was about the people who walked beside her, unseen by the cameras, the immigrants who worked twice as hard for half as much, the young women who were told they were too loud, the children who grew up believing their dreams had expiration dates. Jasmine carried all of them when she stepped into that chamber. Every syllable she spoke echoed with their presence. Every refusal to bend was a reminder that they too deserved a voice that couldn't be bought. She didn't posture. She didn't play act. Her strength came from lived reality, from scars that her adversaries could never comprehend. And that was what made her dangerous in their eyes. She didn't just argue. She embodied the very values their money could never touch. The irony was sharp. The very background they mocked her for was the foundation of her power. The hardships, the dismissals, the grind, these weren't weaknesses. They were credentials. They were proof that she belonged not because someone granted her permission, but because she took what was denied. So when the confrontation began, when the $15,000 check entered the scene, Jasmine wasn't rattled. She had been preparing for that moment her entire life. And as she leaned into her response, the air shifted. The arrogance of her opponent met the immovable force of her resilience. Because this wasn't the story of a woman caught off guard by money. This was the story of a fighter who knew that dignity outlasts wealth, that justice outweighs arrogance, that silence is the true currency of oppression. And Jasmine Crockett had long ago decided she would never pay that price. But knowing her strength was one thing. Seeing how she wielded it in the heat of battle was another. And as the debate escalated, the entire room would soon discover what it meant to go head-to-head with someone who could not be bought. The tension was already palpable before the first words were exchanged. The check sat on the table like a taunt, its presence heavy enough to warp the air around it. Across from Jasmine, the man who had orchestrated it leaned forward, a thin smile cutting across his face. He had played this game before. He knew how to bait, how to needle, how to rattle his opponents until they broke under the pressure. To him, Jasmine was just another obstacle to be borne down. But what he didn't understand, what he could never understand, was that she thrived under pressure. While others flinched at the weight of expectation, Jasmine drew strength from it. Her eyes locked on his, steady and unblinking, as if to signal, "I see you, and I will not move." The first volley came not in shouts, but in measured condescension. He spoke as though lecturing a child, his words dripping with the kind of polished disdain that comes from decades of unchecked privilege. He called her misguided. He implied she was too emotional to understand the complexities of governance. He mocked her credentials, belittled her victories, and framed her passion as inexperience. Each jab was designed to provoke, to make her lose her footing. But Jasmine did not flinch. She listened. stone still, the silence between his insults cutting sharper than any rebuttal. And when she finally did speak, her words were calm, deliberate, each one chosen with surgical precision. She didn't shout, she didn't sneer. She simply cut through the noise with the kind of clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Her restraint only seemed to frustrate him further. He grew louder, his words spilling faster, his hands slicing the air as though volume could compensate for the weakness of his argument. The more he talked, the more he revealed. Not strength, but desperation. He wanted the room to see Jasmine unravel. Instead, it was he who began to fray. Spectators leaned forward in their seats. Some glanced between the two, sensing the tide turning. What had started as a calculated attempt to humiliate was shifting into something far more dangerous for him. Exposure. Every insult he hurled highlighted the arrogance that defined him. Every calm reply from Jasmine illuminated her discipline, her mastery, her refusal to play by his rules. By the time the exchange reached its peak, the chamber felt like a battlefield. His voice boomed, her responses cut clean, and the distance between them was no longer measured in words, but in credibility. Jasmine stood unshaken, embodying the very resilience they had tried to buy off. And with every passing moment, it became clear, the longer he pushed, the more legendary her answer would become. And then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, Jasmine leaned in. Her voice lowered, her tone sharpened. The room fell into an uneasy silence, every eye fixed on her. What came next would not just be a rebuttal. It would be a strike so precise, so devastating, that even her opponent's allies would struggle to defend him. Because the debate wasn't about to end in words. It was about to end in a moment no one would forget. The silence before her words felt almost sacred. Every shuffle of paper stopped, every cough swallowed, as if the entire room understood that something irreversible was about to happen. Jasmine leaned forward, her gaze never breaking from the man across the table. And then, with the voice calm enough to slice through steel, she spoke. "You think my voice is worth $15,000? She asked, her tone even but laced with fire. "Let me tell you something. My voice was bought and paid for a long time ago, by the people who sent me here, by the families working double shifts, by the students drowning in debt, by the grandmothers who marched so I could even sit in this chair. And their investment? It can't be cashed out with your pocket change." The chamber erupted with murmurs. Cameras zoomed in. Even those who had been only half listening snapped their attention back to her. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, but the clarity of her words carried further than any shout. Her opponent shifted, suddenly less certain. He tried to interrupt, to reclaim the narrative, but Jasmine lifted a hand ever so slightly, commanding silence without force. She pressed on. "You think dignity can be priced, that integrity is negotiable, that voices like mine only exist to be managed, bought, and silenced. But here's what you don't understand. Your offer says more about you than it ever could about me. Because for all your wealth, for all your power, the one thing you don't have is what I came here with, the truth." The audience felt the weight of those words. It wasn't just a counterpunch. It was a dismantling. Her statement turned his $15,000 check into a symbol of corruption, arrogance, and fear. The check was no longer just an insult. It was evidence, a self-inflicted wound. Her opponent tried again to intervene, louder this time. He accused her of grandstanding, claimed she was misinterpreting his intentions, but Jasmine wasn't finished. She leaned closer, her eyes steady, her tone dropping lower until the silence in the room deepened, forcing everyone to lean in. "I've been underestimated my whole life. People like you told me I wasn't smart enough, polished enough, powerful enough. But every time you tried to close the door, I found another way in. And now you try to shut me up with money? Let me make it plain. I cannot be bought. I cannot be bullied. And I will not be silenced." The line landed like a thunderclap. For a moment, there was no sound. Then came the ripple. First gasps, then scattered applause that swelled into something undeniable. Even those who weren't supporters felt the pull of history in the making. Her opponent's face flushed red, his composure cracking. He stammered something about professionalism, about decorum, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Every word he spoke now only emphasized the contrast, his bluster against her poise, his arrogance against her authenticity. And Jasmine wasn't done. She pivoted, expanding her focus beyond the man in front of her, speaking directly to the audience in the room and to the millions who would watch later. "This isn't just about me," she declared. "It's about every person who has been told their silence is the price of survival. It's about every family forced to choose between speaking up and keeping the little they have. It's about every immigrant who came to this country believing in freedom, only to be told their voice was disposable. If you think I will betray them for $15,000, then you've learned nothing about why I am here." The applause now grew louder, echoing against the chamber walls. Journalists scribbled furiously, knowing these lines would make headlines. Social media feeds lit up instantly as clips began to circulate, hashtags forming in real time. Her opponent slumped back slightly, realizing he had not just lost the exchange, he had lost control of the narrative. He had set the stage for her legend. Jasmine delivered the final blow with a pause that stretched just long enough to command breathless attention. Then she spoke with a sharpness that cut through the noise. "You thought you were ending this conversation with a check? But I promise you this, what you started today will echo far beyond this room. Because you didn't just underestimate me, you underestimated the people I represent, and they cannot be bought." The chamber erupted. Applause thundered, echoing off the marble, drowning out any attempt at rebuttal. Her opponent sat frozen, his weapon turned against him, his arrogance shattered under the weight of her words. And as Jasmine sat back, calm, almost serene, the cameras captured an image that would travel far beyond the walls of power. A woman unmoved by wealth, unshaken by intimidation, and unafraid to stand tall in the face of arrogance. But what no one in that room could have predicted was how far her words would travel, because even as the echoes of applause faded, the true shockwaves were only beginning. And when they hit, they would transform this clash into something larger than politics, into a cultural moment that shook the nation. The clip didn't just circulate, it ignited. Within minutes of leaving that chamber, the footage of Jasmine's counterattack had hit social platforms like a spark in dry brush. First came the raw uploads from audience members' phones, shaky but electric. Then came the polished cuts from journalists, trimmed into tight 30-second bursts designed for maximum impact. And before the evening sun had set, hashtags bearing her name were climbing into the global trending lists. One video captioned, "They tried to buy her silence. She gave them history instead," racked up millions of views overnight. Another clip paired her line, "I cannot be bought, I cannot be bullied, and I will not be silenced," with swelling cinematic music shared across TikTok and Instagram reels where it spread like wildfire. Suddenly, Jasmine wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a symbol, a voice that people across backgrounds claimed as their own. The responses reflected the scale of the moment. Immigrant communities lit up comment threads with messages of gratitude and pride. Young activists stitched her words into videos of their own struggles, adding captions like, "This is what representation looks like." Parents shared clips with their children, urging them to watch, to listen, to understand the power of standing tall. Even celebrities chimed in, actors, musicians, authors, quoting her lines, calling her a hero. But it wasn't just admiration, it was participation. Across the country, people began gathering in community centers, classrooms, and coffee shops, replaying the video, analyzing every word. Hashtags evolved into rallying cries. "Unbought, unbroken." Hashtag "Stand with Jasmine." Hashtag "Voices Matter." Posters appeared overnight in cities, wheat pasted onto walls, bearing her image with the defiant line, "They cannot be bought." And then came the think pieces. Major outlets rushed to frame the moment. Some called it a masterclass in political courage. Others labeled it the birth of a new movement. International media picked it up too, framing Jasmine's stand as part of a global struggle against corruption and silencing. Her words had crossed borders, resonating in places far removed from the marble halls where she first spoke them. Her opponent, meanwhile, faced a storm of his own making. Headlines branded him the man who tried and failed to buy silence. Editorial cartoons depicted him waving a check while Jasmine towered above him. Memes proliferated, turning his offer into a punchline. Photoshopped $15,000 checks floated through timelines with captions like, "When you underestimate the wrong woman." His reputation, once formidable, now appeared fragile, unraveling in real time. But beyond the means, something deeper was stirring. Ordinary people who had long felt voiceless suddenly saw themselves reflected in Jasmine's defiance. A janitor in Detroit posted a video saying, "I've been told to shut up and just do my job my whole life." Seeing her say those words, it felt like she was speaking for me. A teacher in Texas wrote, "I told my students that their voices matter, but it's rare they see proof. Today, they saw it." It was more than viral. It was transformative. Political strategists scrambled to understand it. Some tried to downplay it as a passing trend, but the numbers told a different story. Fundraising for Jasmine's causes skyrocketed. Grassroots organizations reported surges in volunteers, citing her speech as inspiration. Polls showed a spike in her recognition across demographics, especially among young people in immigrant communities. Inside her team's headquarters, the energy was electric. Staffers watched the metrics climb, their screens lighting up with notifications, donations, messages of support. But amidst the celebration, there was also a sobering realization. This wasn't simply a viral moment. It was a turning point. And with turning points came responsibility and backlash. Because while millions cheered her courage, others sharpened their knives. Commentators on hostile networks painted her as radical, angry, disrespectful. Political adversaries began plotting how to frame her defiance as recklessness. Behind closed doors, phone calls were being made, alliances forged, strategies drafted to contain the wildfire she had sparked. Yet none of that diminished the raw power of what had happened. For every attempt to smear her, there were 10 more voices rising in her defense. Artists began sketching her portrait, musicians sampling her words into protest anthems, community leaders quoting her in speeches. She had transcended the walls of Congress. Her defiance belonged to the people now. And that was the real story. This wasn't simply a victory in a hearing room. It was proof that a single act of courage could ripple outward, gathering force until it became unstoppable. But even as the world celebrated, the question lingered. What would come next? Could this viral surge be sustained? Could it be translated into lasting change? Or would the forces arrayed against her strike back harder, determined to crush what she had ignited? The celebration was real, but so was the danger, and Jasmine knew it. As she watched the numbers climb on her phone late that night, her expression wasn't triumph, it was resolve, because she understood the truth that others only began to grasp. This wasn't the end of the fight, it was the beginning. In the quiet after the storm, when the headlines slowed and the hashtag stabilized, Jasmine did what few expected. She didn't gloat. She didn't bask in the viral glow. Instead, she addressed her supporters directly, not with fireworks, but with the same clarity and dignity that had carried her through the confrontation. Standing before a small crowd in her district, ordinary people, not cameras, she spoke with a steadiness that pierced deeper than any trending clip ever could. What they tried to do to me, she said, was not about me alone. It was about silencing all of us who come from communities told to wait our turn, to keep quiet, to know our place. They thought a number could measure our dignity. They were wrong. The room held stillness, the kind that carries weight, because those words were not just a reflection of one moment. They were a mirror for countless lives lived under the shadow of dismissal. She framed it simply. This wasn't a battle over a check. It was a battle over worth. And worth, she reminded them, cannot be bought. Her story turned into a parable. Parents recounted it to children as proof that character outweighs money. Teachers used it as an example in classrooms of courage in the face of corruption. Activists pointed to it as a blueprint for how to turn attempts at suppression into fuel for defiance. And beyond the politics, there was a deeper lesson, a truth about America itself. That its strength doesn't come from the loudest checkbook or the most powerful title, but from people willing to stand firm when every force demands their silence. Jasmine's refusal to bow to money echoed the best chapters of the American story. The marchers who walked despite threats, the workers who organized despite firings, the immigrants who built lives despite every barrier. For many, her stand wasn't just an inspiring speech. It was a reminder of identity. For immigrants, it was validation that their voices matter. For young women of color, it was a beacon proving that no insult or bribe could erase their brilliance. For every person ever underestimated, it was an anthem. I will not be bought. I will not be silenced. And so, her legacy from that day was more than a viral clip, more than a political win. It was moral clarity. It was the idea that dignity, once asserted, reverberates far beyond a single room. It was proof that even when the odds lean toward power, truth has its own gravity. But even as she spoke words of inspiration, she left her supporters with a challenge. Don't let this end with me, she urged. Take this energy into your own lives, your own struggles. Stand up when they tell you to sit down. Speak when they tell you to be quiet. If my defiance means anything, it means that you can do the same. That was the heart of her message. Not that she was extraordinary, but that everyone had the power to resist being reduced to a price tag. Her speech became less about Jasmine Crockett the politician and more about every viewer, every listener, every believer who wanted to carry that fire into their own battles. By the end, the applause was not the raucous cheer of celebration, but something deeper, the long sustained clapping of people who recognized themselves in her. It wasn't about entertainment, it was about empowerment. And as the cameras inevitably returned, trying to capture her next move, Jasmine reminded them again. This was never about spectacle. It was about principle. She had turned their attempts to buy her silence into a universal truth, one that could not be contained to a single chamber or even a single moment in time. Because when dignity rises against corruption, when truth stands unbought and unbroken, it doesn't just make headlines, it makes history. But even in history, there is always the question of legacy. And Jasmine's story, as unforgettable as it already was, still needed one final chapter. An ending not just with reflection, but with a call to action. Something that would leave her supporters not only inspired, but mobilized. And that final call was coming next. Her voice, calm yet unshakable, carried into her final words of the evening. They thought they could put a price on silence. What we showed them together is that dignity is priceless. The crowd erupted, but Jasmine held her hand up gently, not for quiet, but for attention. This moment doesn't belong to me. It belongs to all of us, every person who's ever been told they don't belong, every voice that's ever been pushed to the margins. Today was proof that no one can take away your worth. And then she turned the focus outward. But this can't stop here. If you felt power in my words, carry them into your own fights. Speak when others try to hush you. Stand firm when they try to push you aside. That's how we win, not once, but over and over again. Her tone softened yet sharpened with purpose. If you believe in this, share this story, not for me, for the people who need to see it, who need to know that resistance is possible, that courage is contagious. Let them know they are not alone. The call was clear, not just to support her, but to stand with her, to turn outrage into action, applause into momentum, to subscribe not only to her voice, but to the movement of voices refusing to be bought, refusing to be broken. And with that, she left them with one final truth. Simple, undeniable, unforgettable. They can try to buy silence, but they will never own our voices. As the applause swelled again, the message hung in the air. An invitation, a challenge, a promise. The fight was far from over. And now it belonged to everyone watching.